All right.
Great, thank you. Welcome all to our June 13th meeting of the PUC's Technical Advisory Group on the implementation of the Clean Heat Standard. I'm Rick Weston, the chair. We've got a quorum. We're all set to go. A little early housekeeping as usual. Please, everyone, stay muted unless you are speaking, and you will raise your hand to get in the queue for speaking at the appropriate times. We ask that non-members of the TAG, members of the public who are joining us, to keep your video off until the public comment period, and for TAG members to keep their video on so that we're all seeing each other. We've got some alternates today for alternates, resident experts from Efficiency Vermont: Adam Sherman, David Westman, and Haley Rowe, and Matthew Bakerspool for TJ Poor, and one other. Is that correct, Catherine? Did you mention?
No, I think TJ's. So
Okay.
I think Matthew's the other one.
We're all set. Okay,
Yep.
Great. Let's begin by asking if there are any changes that folks would like to make to the agenda. We've got a number of things on the agenda. Anything anyone wants to add or amend? Okay. If not, then I hope you've all had a chance to take a look at the minutes from the prior meeting. And I seek a motion to approve them unless there are changes that ought to be made, and we can discuss them first.
So moved.
So moved. Any discussion? No? All in favor of the of approving the minutes of the previous meeting, signify by raising your hand. Okay, looks like we're good there. Okay, all opposed, raise your hand. Okay, seeing none, they're approved, and we're out of the.
I'm going to abstain. Ken Jones.
Because you were not here.
Yep.
Yep. That's perfectly fine. Okay. Well, then we'll dive right into the draft recommendations that the pacing subgroup has put together in response to the PUC's straw proposal on pacing. There's a lot here. I want to remind folks that we're not making any final decisions here today. We should focus on clarifying the statements, giving feedback to the pacing subgroup so that they can further refine their comments. Obviously, we want to iron out any ambiguities, and if there are significant differences of opinion, we want to work through them. Michelle is going to use some slides to walk through the 4 issues. We're going to try to manage the time that we have efficiently, but it may be that we'll need to stretch it out a little bit, but we'll see. We will see. With that in mind, then Michelle, Catherine, may I turn it over to you?
Yeah, you should be seeing Michelle's slides, I hope. No?
Yes, I can see them. So I
Okay.
trust that they're coming through as long as people are out of full screen mode so that they can see that other screen. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Rick, for the opportunity to share the work that the pacing subgroup has been doing over the past several months now.
Ken, do you have a question before we get started? Your hand went up immediately.
Yeah, do you want questions during or after?
Up to you, Michelle. I think there's a lot. We want to certainly break it up into the 4 different issues or 5 different issues. Anyway, break it up and stop after each one. Would that work for you both?
I think so. I think it's important to keep them, to not save them to the end. So we can do that and recognize that we've got a generous hour here. I believe we can get through things, as Rick mentioned. We are going to revisit this in 2 weeks at our next session. Looking at the dates to make sure that isn't the 4th of July holiday. So this is
27th of June.
Yes, so this is our opportunity to share our thinking, the subgroup, and incorporate that into the larger discussions that have been taking place within this full tag, and to, as Rick said, further clarify what we have started to put down on paper. So just for reference and for those on the phone, the full straw proposal as submitted by the commission is available through EPUC. We're taking excerpts from that for our discussion today. So let's go to the next slide, please, Catherine. So here I want to put things into context, because even if you're looking at that, the work order back in April 19th, when the commission reorganized things, and my apologies for the order in the second column there, started out with the 2 bolded topics here in where the commission is considering the public input process complete. A big part of the feedback that the commission received was that there were too many individual topics to be posted, wait for public comment, and then come back to discuss and act on those. So items 3 through 8 reflect the reorganization that the commission put together. So we are focusing today on part 1 of the pacing steps, which again is the overall process for setting the Clean Heat Standard credit retirement schedule. A big ask, essentially what we want to implement the statute. So they have broken it out into 4 steps, which we are going to discuss today. And there is also a low and moderate income customer element within that. We are not going to discuss that at this point. And these other steps show you that there's plenty of other things going on and contributing to the processes that we're going to discuss today. Next slide, please. So the 4 topics that Rick mentioned that the commission has proposed to address with this initial straw proposal are the emission schedule.
Come downstairs, Arnold. Pass us out.
Remind everyone to make sure you're muted.
Thank you. So we've got an emission schedule to be established and updated on a regular basis. Carbon intensity values for the liquid and gaseous fossil fuels that will be used in the calculations. Setting the actual pace or reduction requirements for the thermal sector. And then the requirements of the individual obligated parties. On to the next slide, please. So first part here, the emission schedule, which is, we've talked about the fact that the schedule leads one to think about timeline or trajectory. This is actually the list of clean heat measures that will be both considered for implementation for the clean heat credits and the relative life cycle emission rates applied to each of those, both initially and over the course of time. So here, our comments from the pacing subgroup are primarily that the commission has a clear process laid out for this first step in the process. And in particular, it's important to note that there will be 3 and 10-year regular adjustments to the characterizations of the measures, the calculations, and the list that's used for acceptable measures through the implementation of this. I'll open it here for discussions or questions.
think you're good to go.
Excellent. This is the most straightforward part of things. Next slide, please. With that, so the list will be set up. The next step in the process is to set carbon intensity values. So the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for each of the fuels. And here's both setting meeting the rate of decline, the steps that have been spelled out within statute, and also defining what the trajectory will be between those milestones. I have listed that the statute calls out figures for 2025, 2030, and 2050. And the Commission has proposed a step change for the first 5 years. So starting off with carbon intensity values must be below 80 at the start of implementation and below 60 in 2030 with just a straight line and then a step change at 2030. There are pros and cons to having a step change versus some sort of a slope. The group was in agreement that especially for the first 5 years, having the step change would give us an opportunity to see how things come together with implementation, and then perhaps keep the step change or implement a different slope for the years beyond 2030.
Ken?
Yeah, my only suggestion is not necessarily to exclude wood. In that I think that, we know there's a lot of controversy about wood, and over time, we may be looking at different harvesting practices that might influence the overall sort of carbon budget with regards to the burning of wood. And I think that would fit into this carbon intensity value. Not that it's going to happen in the early run, because it's going to take a lot of work, but between now and 2050, that issue may arise. So I'd put a wood fuel kind of parenthetically that someday we may need to consider a carbon intensity value for wood fuels.
And the interesting thing there, Ken, is that at this point in time, wood is not mentioned in statute for carbon intensity. But that's... Are there any other hands?
Yeah, this is Matthew Baker-Poole with the Department of Public Service. I was just going to say essentially the same thing, that the part of the statute we're referring to here with the declining carbon intensity requirement is for liquid and gaseous fuels. So wood would not be in that category.
Matt has his hand up as well.
This is Matt Coda. The question is, and perhaps this is in the written stuff, but have you delineated the different types of sustainably sourced biofuels, or in terms of the categories, or wood too? I mean, between wood and renewable natural gas, renewable propane, renewable diesel, biodiesel.
All important questions from both of you. The point, what we've had to keep reminding ourselves here is that we are looking at the process at this point. So the specifics of those figures as applied to each of the individual fuels, that's going to come in the future steps.
Okay, can I have one more follow-up question? Will that be done by a consultant, in which consultant that will be looking at those that metric?
Opinion Dynamics will look at carbon intensity values and putting together the emission schedule.
Thank you.
Patrick? Patrick Wood, can you unmute your phone?
There we go. Sorry, I thought I had done it on the actual phone. So, can you hear me now?
Yep, we can.
Okay, great. I wanted to speak mostly to the second bullet and the choice to start with a step change, and mostly I wanted to describe what's happened in California's LCFS program for some consideration. They started with a curve, and they found what happened over time is that there was oversupply and under demand, so market price tanked. That resulted in or people are concerned it will result in a lack of investment over time because there's less incentive to develop the new technologies. And what they're in the midst of now, as they consider amendments to their regulation, is incremental step changes to increase demand. And they're also considering an automatic acceleration mechanism, is what they call it, so that the curve can be adjusted more fluidly and without rulemaking processes, and more often. So, oh, and I realized, sorry, I didn't have my video on. So I just wanted to put that out there as something for this group, for this work group who's more focused on this than I've been, to consider, is that if you start with just step changes, it may inhibit the functioning of a market if they can't be adjusted quickly. That's all. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Patrick, could I follow up? What's the time frame that they've been working with where they determined they needed to do incremental step changes? Was it after 1 year or 3 years?
I think they're, and Floyd, feel free to step in, you might be closer to this than I am, but I think they're about, I mean, the program is about almost 10 years in, but the process of considering a change to essentially adjust supply and demand so the market can function better, that's turning into a 3-year process, which is inhibiting the functioning of the market. So that's why having, and I don't have the perspective here to understand how nimble step changes could be made in this Clean Heat Standard program, but if it requires full rulemakings and other things that are time consuming and slow, it may not be nimble enough to allow for a well-functioning market.
That's helpful. Thank you, Patrick. At this point, we are proposing to accept the step change between the start in 2025 and the first 5-year increment in 2030.
Yep.
Brian?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Do you mind if I ask Patrick a question, or do you want to move on? It's just
No,
about the details of the market. So yeah, Patrick, when you say the market crashed, is that the market? There's an oversupply of what? Allowance, like low carbon fuel credits or compliant fuel? And what crashed? The price of the fuel or the price of the credits, or both?
I know the price of the credits. There's a debate going on about how that will impact the price of fuel in California, but essentially there was so much renewable diesel coming into the market, and so much and a large volume of low CI credits from dairy biomethane, because their CI is so low, that the credit market crashed, not the everyday fuels market. So instead of having, I mean, the price for several years was $200 a ton, led to tons of investment. And a lot of people probably think that was too high, and people can have their different opinions on that. Now, if the price is more like at $40 a ton, it inhibits investment. And somewhere in between is maybe a balance, and I don't have all of that econometric analysis on what makes the most sense.
Floyd, I saw your hand go up. Do you have clarification on this issue?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry if I end up coughing here because I'm coming on the tail end of a really bad case of bronchitis. But to add to what Patrick said, I mean, I personally wouldn't characterize it as a crash. I mean, it's a softening of the credits. But to the question that was posed, I mean, what happened basically is the market responded exactly the way CARB, asked it to do. So California set these declining standards, and the market responded by producing more electric vehicles and, much more biodiesel and renewable diesel to respond to that market signal. The problem was the market signal itself was not strong enough to keep up with that, the supply side. And so you end up with, 60% of the diesel fuel pool in California being replaced in that time span with biodiesel and renewable diesel, which is a great thing for GHGs and air quality. But the upshot is that, because there was lack of harmony between the CI score, the CI targets, and the supply that was coming in, CARB has now undertaken a rulemaking to make those targets more stringent, and then to avoid a similar situation as Patrick alluded to, they're looking at adopting a auto acceleration mechanism to have the CI the targets self-adjust without going through a lengthy and onerous rulemaking. I would not recommend that the state put that in, that auto acceleration mechanism in the first place. At this initial stage, I mean, perhaps that's something that you can consider down the road. This is a first time for any of the West Coast states to consider an auto acceleration mechanism. So, for prudency, I would recommend that you wait and see how that works, see what lessons are learned, and then see if that, can be applied later on down the road. I hope that helps.
It does. Thank you.
Matthew, and then Emily.
I just wanted to comment to Patrick's concern that there could be potentially a glut of credits based on the step change. The step change is laid out as sort of the bare minimum requirement. It'll end up having allowable carbon intensities that are well behind the relative emissions reductions pace. So you could almost consider these fuels contributing less than they otherwise would to actual emissions reductions. So either you have to increase the volume of delivery of these fuels to make up for essentially a lag between the carbon intensity decline of the fuel and the requirement in the sector. So it's less likely that this would result in a glut as far as I can tell. And rather, the only change that I would propose is moving the step change to either lead or be in parity with the emissions reduction schedule for the sector at large, so that you don't have a bunch of fuels that could have had lower carbon intensities going into the marketplace very late into the program, say in 2045, if the trajectory was flat all the way to the end of the program.
And Catherine, this would be a good time to proceed to the next slide, which where Matthew had also addressed that topic a bit.
Yeah, let's take Emily's hand and,
They're all,
Well,
they're
that-
all related. They're all related to the same carbon intensity value
okay,
as far as the slide.
Yeah, that was going to be my suggestion, that we maybe hold continued conversation until we've shared, Michelle has gone through the rest of the bullets related to this point, because we're now getting ahead of the conversation. And similarly, and then I just wanted to note that we have been assuming that if we did do a step change between 2025 and 2030, that there would be a real checkpoint where the PUC would sort of revisit the program sometime around 2030. We have to think about the exact year that happens. But to see sort of how things are going and make a number of adjustments, including some of the suggestions that have been made today, could be part of that consideration. So I just wanted to emphasize that, but please do go to the next slide.
Okay.
Oh, there they are. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
okay, back to you, Michelle.
Okay, well, thank you to Matthew and Emily for really bringing out the key parts of these two bullets that are now in front of you. Is that we recommend the step change for the first 5 years, and then consider a great deal of information that's going to be available at a later date to understand both what the trajectory might be if we want to keep that step change right through 2030, and how we want the carbon intensity value to impact choices that fuel dealers are making in the selection of measures and ways to achieve their credits.
And you want to go on to that second bullet and explain that, and then we'll start with questions again? Is there anything else in there that you need to explain?
I think Matthew started things there. So I'd take questions, and it looks like Matthew might be the one with his hand up first.
Yeah, I'm happy to try and elaborate on the second bullet if anybody has questions. I do want to mention some softening of the last sentence of the third section. So in a hypothetical where a majority of the measures being implemented are fuels that lag the sector reduction, I don't think we can make the assertion that the requirement won't be met. It would just require a substantial offset to move the average reduction rate to meet the requirement. So you would have a very large portion of measures that don't really do enough to get you to your requirement in, say, 2045. If the step change wasn't adjusted after 2030, you would have to have either sequestration or something else with significant effective carbon intensity reduction to offset your lagging credits. So we could change that to instead say, if the majority of the measure mix was significantly lagging measures, the sector requirement might be difficult to meet.
Brian.
Yeah, this is an easy one, actually. So in the slide, in the second bullet, it starts at that paragraph that starts as a hypothetical. In the PDF, it looks like you kind of say the same thing twice in that bullet in 2 sentences.
Yes, it was streamlined for here. And thank you for your patience that the PDF that you have is a draft.
Okay, great. Thank you for noting that.
So I just want to encourage everybody on the committee to just be sure that you get out all your questions now, because as Rick said, we're hoping that these refinements that are being suggested will be considered by the group, the pacing subgroup, and you'll see a new version of this next meeting, and we'll be asking you to make, to vote, to make a decision, to reach agreement, a strong agreement on it. So please do surface any questions. No question is too dumb, as they say. Any questions you have, to make sure you completely understand what's being recommended.
Thank you, Catherine. And I will add that the pacing subgroup will be meeting again next Thursday morning. So if you have questions that come to mind after this meeting, feel free to email them to Catherine or consider joining us at that meeting next Thursday for further discussion.
Are there any other questions on this particular point? Should we move to the next slide?
Please. All right, so this setting and adjusting the thermal sector emissions reduction requirements. This is a lengthy section of the straw proposal and also a longer section within the draft comments document. I've got the proposed steps broken out in 2 slides here again, so that we can, for simplicity and to help focus our discussion. It's important to begin by establishing a baseline. We need to know what the starting point is to understand the emissions reductions and the progress thereof. So in the course of our discussions, agreed that having a weather normalized baseline year and weather normalizing throughout the evaluations is important, and that the baseline year be linked ideally to the most recent fuel tax data. We are basing a lot of this work on the greenhouse gas inventory that ANR is maintaining for the Global Warming Solutions Act. That will be the starting point as well. However, the resources of data for that are not necessarily the same. At this point, they're not necessarily the same as for what we're proposing with the fuel tax data and the way things are going to be tracked for the clean heat standard. So I'll stop right there for point 1 for comments.
Can I just jump in and offer a clarification on behalf of the pacing
Please
group
do.
before we move to questions, because this also relates to Matt's email about the off-road diesel. I wanted to note that, so the alternatives we were considering, we have the fuel tax data, which is available in a much more timely fashion, and we can get more recent data. We have kind of the goals. We could work off of the goals, or we could work off of the inventory, which has a 3-year lag. So we had a lot of conversation around that in the pacing group. And we also talked to Colin Smith from ANR, who leads the work on the greenhouse gas inventory. And he has clarified that they are working on incorporating the fuel tax data into the greenhouse gas inventory as a better source than what they are currently using, which is like a national data set it's just not Vermont specific. And that as he does that, he'll essentially be able to calculate kind of the thermal RCI, residential, commercial, industrial section of the inventory kind of ahead of time. And the only reason it can't be published is because of the lag in getting data for other sectors, but the thermal sector could actually be done kind of according to inventory methodologies much more promptly. And part of that would involve, and he's working on this now, taking out the off-road diesel. Like, he's got some methodology that he's looking at to remove that from the sector, because that does need to be removed to reflect the heating related emissions associated with that sector. So I just wanted to note, because that speaks to your email, Matt, that Colin is aware of that and is working on a process to make an adjustment for that, so he can use the fuel tax data with that adjustment to get a more timely kind of thermal section of the inventory. And that's that adjusted version of the inventory based on recent fuel tax data and weather normalization is what we're proposing to use. At least I think that's what we've discussed. Michelle, feel free to.
Thank you. Yes. And the implication through all of these is that the RCI data from the greenhouse gas inventory is adjusted to, for all of any place it's referenced here, so that the non-road diesel and any transportation fuels are not included.
Matt, I know you might have some clarification on this as well, or some insights.
Yeah, and I know the struggle. We're all dealing with different data sets and trying to figure out the best ones to use. And I will not pretend to know about the different data sets for greenhouse gases and how to calculate that. But I do know gallons because I've lived in this world for 20 years, and Vermont gallons specifically. And I know Ken and I have worked on this 20 years ago on how to get the best data to the tax department when it comes to the fuel tax. And the good news is that the data sets are changing in that we are finally listing on the 25th of the month, every month, when we pay our fuel tax, the 2 cent per gallon fuel tax, itemizing difference between heating oil, kerosene, and dyed diesel. Dyed diesel, which is not used for thermal purposes. That's a positive thing. And so we'll have better data going forward. But anything past propane, kerosene, heating oil, and dyed diesel, again, used for tractors, logging equipment, skidders, feller bunchers, trains, power generators, all looped into one basket of fuel that we pay tax on. So that's changing, which is a positive thing. But also the problem with using the fuel tax, even with the improved reporting mechanism that was in Act 18, the problem with using the fuel tax is that it's only on the point of sale. So when you track the gallons that are collected by the tax department, it is the final point of sale to the consumer. It does not track the gallon at sold once, twice, 3, 4, 5 times after it is brought into the state by the obligated entity, sold in or into Vermont, and then sold, and then resold, and then resold again. So the data sets that's coming into the PUC that is supposed to track every entity that moves that gallon is different from the data set collected by the tax department, which shows the retailer that sells it to the end user. So that's number one. Number two is when the PUC creates the registry to collect the gallons, again, tracking that molecule as it crosses the border to every step of the way before it is burned to create heat, the obligated parties or the registered entities that sell fuel that may not be obligated are discounting or not including the gallons that are sold for non-thermal purposes in accordance with the law. So when you put propane on your fuel tax form on the 25th of the month on FGR 601 form, you are putting all gallons of propane regardless of use, no matter who the end user is. On the form that's put by the registry in accordance with Act 18, you are discounting the propane that is not used for thermal purposes. So dryers, power generation, cooking, that comes off. So there's different nuances to this, and I don't want anyone to think there's someone, I mean, EAN does slick reports, great, but it's not accurate. It's not accurate at all. So I don't want people to take the EAN report and go, oh, these are how many gallons of use we're using for heating fuel based on this tax data. No, that's how much taxes we paid, but that does not comport with what those gallons are used for and whether they're used for thermal purposes, because that's the goal of the clean heat standard, not to reduce the fuel that goes into the farmer's tractor, but to use the fuel that goes into the tank that heats someone's home. Thank you.
Can I just respond to that for a second? Ask like a follow-up question. In terms of the not reflecting all the interim sales that occur within the state, I think that's okay for the purpose of the exercise we're doing here, which is specifically to understand the level of emissions from this sector to set the baseline and anchor the trajectory for pacing. So I guess I wanted to ask that question. Does that seem right to you, Matt, or do you think, because there are different uses of this, obviously, and in terms of like apportioning the credits, I can see that there might be challenges using it because of those resales that you mentioned, but for the purposes of the emission reduction trajectory.
Well, I mean, what it comes down to is where are you starting from?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're using the fuel tax data, including all of the thermal purposes for propane and all of the dyed diesel purposes, you're starting here. When in actuality, we should be starting here because of those gallons are not part of the clean heat standard. So in many ways, using the more accurate data, not the data from EAN, they're guesstimates, but using actual data that shows what we're actually using for thermal purposes would in fact show that maybe the effort to get to 40% reduction by 2030 is not as steep as we thought. It's not. That's a positive thing for cost. If this process goes away, the bigger that gulf is between where we are now and where we need to be, the higher the cost is going to be on consumers or the credit, the obligated parties in order to obtain credits. If we realize,
Yeah,
oh no,
we
at
are-
this point, we're here, the cost actually gets lower.
Yeah,
I'd
and
like to jump in if I could, just to keep this moving along, because I think Emily and Matt, you have touched on something that did come up in our discussions, and it shows up in a later slide here when we're talking about the final process. And the PUC is, as Matt has noted, proposing to use the figures in the EAN, and the pacing subgroup had in fact made the recommendation that the commission use the information from the commission's data, such as Matt's describing, and that will feed into the emission schedule mentioned in the first step. So that's my long way around of saying that we have actually heard those discussions before and acknowledge and recognize what you're pointing out, Matt, and do want to recommend that that these are the appropriate tax records that are utilized, both for setting the baselines and for the projected trajectories.
I appreciate that. I know it's a complicated endeavor to gather all these data sets. EA does a very slick presentation. I don't want anyone to think that that is the authority or that's gospel. They're an organization that has lots of good things in it, but please be aware that there is a different interpretation of that data set.
We've
Thanks.
been. Go ahead.
Thanks, Michelle. I think that was helpful, and we may be able to move on, but Ken, did you have a different question before we move to the next?
Yes, I do. I do want to follow up a little bit. Some of the what Matt says is non-thermal applications actually are going to be covered by the Clean Heat Standard. Commercial use and industrial use of these fuels is included in the Clean Heat Standard. So when we develop that database, we can't just exclude fuels that are used for non-building heat purposes. So that's part. But my reason for raising the hand is I have a couple of suggestions. One is I believe that the baseline year should be 2022. And the reason for that is because clean heat measure installations begin in 2023. And this relates to the linearity piece. Linear, it sounds great, but it's going to be, I'll say, problematic, because the first obligation year, if the first obligation year is 2026, it includes all of the measures installed in 23, 24, 25, and 26. And then to assume a linearity to 27 means you have to replicate all of the 23, 24, 25, 26 installations in 27. And I don't think anyone, I mean, it probably doesn't meet people's understanding of what linearity is, but that's why I start 22 as a baseline and recognize the curve that we'll have some information on by later this year. Well, we certainly have some information on 23, and as when we establish a number for 26, we'll understand 24. We'll have a little bit of curve. It will not be linear. It cannot be linear. So anyway, that's one point. And another point is to get to what Matt's issue is, which I agree with entirely. We need to have an appropriate understanding of the data. I would ask that we begin the reconciliation process now. We have the 2020 greenhouse gas inventory. We have some data from tax that's related to 2020, and we're working towards the 2021 greenhouse gas inventory. We have the 2021 tax. I would ask that we task, of course, I'm not their boss, but we task Colin and the folks at ANR to begin this reconciliation process so we can see kind of numerically what are these differences between using the historic inventory process and a process that uses tax data, and begin to incorporate carbon intensity values, do this in a spreadsheet where those carbon intensity values can be put in a draft form. And as we vary them, we'll be able to see, okay, what is the impact as we refine the carbon intensity? But I ask that we get this started now, because we'll keep having these qualitative discussions of, well, that'll be different. Well, that'll be different. We need to understand what those differences are. So those are my points. Thanks.
Important points, Ken, and I'll respond quickly by saying that comparison has already begun. And that was a big part of a meeting we had with Colin Smythe to understand how these data sets would relate. And just to complicate things a bit further as they continue, we also learned that the greenhouse gas inventory is something that is revised as newer updated data is available. So even basing everything on that means we've got a moving target, but we don't expect them to be huge changes. That is underway, and we recommend that that continues, and we'll maintain that TAG maintains that communication with ANR to understand how those trends compare and are evolving.
Thanks, Michelle.
All right, I moved us on to the next slide.
Let's see, did I lose steps 4, 5, and 6, Catherine, on the previous one?
Oops, let me see if I can make this start all over again. All right. 3,
No
here you
worries, I am mindful of the time.
Here you go. We in the right place now?
It's not showing up on my
No.
screen yet.
No, it's not on the screen yet.
Oh, maybe I have to reshare. Let me try resharing. Yeah, okay, sorry.
No worries. So we were looking at the first couple of steps and moving on to the reconciling the inventory figures with the life cycle based emissions. And as we've been discussing the tax data, there's a lot of there will be much data to review. We've got information on carbon intensity values that will be coming from Opinion Dynamics. There will also be data on the various fuels that we will need to incorporate that will come from GREET or whatever version of that or a similar tool will be used. So the next step that they're proposing is that reconciliation. And the linear trajectory proposed is the initial. As Ken pointed out, reality is not going to be linear. And this is where, to Matt's point, we have recommended that the emission schedule rather than the emissions factors from the ANR reports be used. Our goal is that the methodology is consistent across the various clean heat standard credits, requirements, excuse me. And to keep this moving along, I'll cover all of these now. It is proposed that right now, looking at the emissions, the trajectory that was established based on the greenhouse gas inventory, apply that directly to this, the life cycle based emissions calculations. And number 5 here is that we've got the targets. That trajectory may actually separate from the trajectory established for the greenhouse gas inventory emissions totals, because we are incorporating all of these other factors that are part of the clean heat standard. So not only will it be not necessarily linear, it may separate out so that they're not just 2 parallel lines. I'm not explaining that particularly well. It is something that we are endeavoring to illustrate better in the final document that we generate.
So do folks understand that and have any questions? Brian?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I had to read this a few times, and I think it's right. Um, but it's
I'm not the
complicated.
clearest. Yes.
I just want to add that at least at my level of understanding, that in order to be able to determine the clean heat credit budget for a year, I mean, when you determine the clean heat credit budget for a year based upon some kind of an assumed mix of clean heat measures, and you know what the life cycle emission factors are, and you know what the inventory methodology emission factors are, then you can do the calculation that way, going from the clean heat credits to the emission reductions as the inventory. But I don't think you can, if you try to do it the other way, which I know you're not proposing here, but if you establish here's what the inventory target needs to be for the GWSA years, and then you say, and now we want to figure out what the budget is, there's actually a number, many, perhaps infinite number of measure mix solutions to that problem. And so you can't do it that way. But I think the way I've been thinking about it is the solutions that are of interest ultimately to the PUC and to the regulated entities and the people who are going to benefit from this is we want to know the solution that's the least cost solution, the measure mix solution. And then we're also interested, I think, in the measure mix solution that results in the lowest amount of life cycle emissions. I think those are two solutions to the problem that are that would be really interesting to have to be able to inform the discussion going forward. And then, of course, it's like an envelope. There's like, again, hundreds or maybe an infinite number of measure mix solutions to be able to get to a particular emission reduction as measured by the inventory. But those are the two that I think are the most relevant to the overall discussion, both to this group and to everybody else.
That is very helpful, Brian. Thank you.
Any other questions, recommended refinements, clarifications here?
Let's move on to the next slide. Which was again, establishing the process for the final setting and adjusting of the obligated party requirements. And this is pretty much taken right out of statute. The commission has proposed these steps to come up with the percent reduction based on the previous year's sales that each obligated party will be required to meet. Updated every 3 years and projected out in 10-year blocks. We as a subgroup did not have many comments on this particular topic ourselves. It's laid out clearly. To Brian's point, we will need to make sure that all parties, all people involved understand the various parameters going into the calculations. Topic that has come up that the PUC cited right in their document is that the statute language specifically calls out sector emissions in the previous year. We've heard many times on these TAG meetings about how data is not available immediately for the previous year. So we're looking at different ways to interpret that, or whether to recommend a statute amendment to set that language so that it's something that can actually be applied in a timely fashion. I know this is something that Matt Coda has mentioned many times, and all involved in these conversations are still thinking about it. So any questions or comments at this point in time?
Yeah, Ken and then Matthew.
Yeah, if we're gonna open up statute, and I haven't talked to Matt about this, but I looked forward to his reaction. I think that, and this is drastic, but I think that the assignment or the assignment of specific amount of credits should be based on the fuel sold during the obligation year. And what this means is the PUC needs to estimate. I mean, the process for establishing the total number of credits for a given year is still all of the things we've been talking about. But then it is, for every obligated party, and then one of Matt's points is obligated parties may change year to year. Some may drop out, some may add on, that some fuel dealers may sell less by their own business practice. So if then the assignment from the PUC is for every 1,000 gallons of fuel oil or propane or 1,000 cubic feet of natural gas, you will be required to retire X credits. And yes, that's an estimation process, but it can be established prior to January 1st of the obligation year. And it provides, I think it solves many of the problems of using prior year utilization to assign credits. As I say, I know that's kind of drastic, but I do think that it really helps. And I do look to Matt's reaction. And I do recognize there's one significant downside, and that is risk largely to the default delivery agent. And I do think the PUC, when it establishes that factor, can also put, I'll say, a ceiling or a limit to the requirement for the default for the number of credits that need to be accumulated during the year, recognizing that the actual number of credits is going to be based on the amount of fuel sold that year, which makes it harder for the DDA to do its planning. But again, together with the PUC assigning credits per volume of fuel sold during the year, they could also assign a limit so that the DDA is not at risk if it's a high sale year and they can't develop the necessary credits. So I say, I know that's drastic, but I give it a shot.
And I'm sorry, just to clarifying, how is that different than I've missed. I don't understand how what you're proposing is different. How is it different than what is currently in the statute?
Okay, so what happens is, if let's say a fuel oil dealer sells 1 million gallons and the PUC says, okay, for year 2020, in 2025, they sell 1 million gallons. Okay, in year 2026, we're going to require you to develop and retire 10,000 credits. If in 2026, they sell 500,000 gallons, they still have to retire 10,000 credits. My suggestion is that during that year, instead of 10,000 credits, they retire 5,000 credits with another entity that may have gone from 1 million to 1.5 million, going from 10,000 that they were assigned to 15,000. I think that's, I'll say, equitable. I think it's appropriate. And I believe the fuel dealers could plan accordingly, knowing that if they're going to sell more fuel, that they're going to need more credits, and they probably will know that. But again, I look to Matt for that reaction. But the scenario I laid out, the one going from 1 million to 500,000 still has to generate the credits based on their 1 million gallon sales, even if they don't sell 1 million. And the most drastic one is the obligated party that in 2025 purchased their fuel from Albany, and in 2026 purchases their fuel from a Vermont obligated party, which means they have no sales under this calculation, but they still have the obligation.
Matt, do you mind if we take Matthew Baker-Pohl, do you mind if we take Matt Coda's reaction
Not
first?
at all.
Yeah, Ken, you nailed it, and I'm happy to join the drastic reopen the statute subcommittee because I think we can figure out this. There's a lot of smart people here, and I think we can all figure out what a service, clean heat service equipment or fuel will reduce in greenhouse gas emissions. We could all figure out what that cost is going to be and how those obligations might be allocated. What I fear we can't figure out, and which is why you've been told I oppose this legislation, is because I don't know how, under the current structure, in which a retailer of fossil heating fuel is obligated for the prior calendar year when these companies come and go, where their sales are up and their sales are down, their suppliers are out of state, their suppliers are in state. I don't know how it's possible even to function for these fuel dealers in this market when you're going to look back. A system that does work, the system that we were accustomed to because we've done it since 1990, is a fee based on, it used to be quarterly, and I think this is more appropriate here, looking back a quarter. Now it's looking back a month. You pay on the 25th of the month for the gallon sold the prior month. Before, it used to be you paid on the 25th of the month for the past quarter, and you paid 4 times a year. That is much more of a one-to-one relationship to the actual buying of the fuel, whether it's obligated or not, the selling of the fuel, and it is eminently more enforceable and more traceable. This system that we're in this box as a technical advisory group because this is what the legislature designed, which I opposed, and I said this was going to happen, which is we're going to have a system where we might figure out how this all works, but there's so many loopholes you could drive a tanker truck through it. So I'm happy to join the subcommittee of the drastic reopen the statute.
Matthew Bakerpool.
I'm not sure if Michelle has this on another slide, but I just wanted to point out PUC's comments with respect to enforcement and unregistered parties, that it would be an inequitable outcome if registrants were burdened with the obligations that should have been attributed to parties that are not registering. And while I understand the non-compliance payment would essentially function as a carrot to get people, or it's the stick that makes you prefer a carrot, and actually registering and other enforcement mechanisms are there still needs to be a way to resolve that disparity. And I don't think that's been fully fleshed out yet.
And I did
Michelle?
not include that. I did not include that in the summary today, Matthew, but important point and nuance is that the commission has made note of in their documentation. And with that, I believe we've come to the end of the slides that I had prepared for today's discussion. This has been very informative to the pacing subgroup. If folks have other comments that you'd like to be put on the record now, let's share them. And I also reissue the invitation to join us at the meeting next Thursday of the pacing subgroup. And after that, we will prepare the final draft document to share with the full tag for review and potential approval on June 27th. I see Rick's hand went up first.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as a matter of process, Michelle, I assume you would be thrilled if folks could send you and the pacing subgroup suggested language and edits to the PDF that you sent around, that we sent around.
Absolutely.
In the meantime, yeah, that'd be great.
And just to clarify, the pacing subgroup link it's a public meeting. The link is on the website and the materials will be posted there in advance if there are any additional materials. So anybody can join. Emily.
Along those lines, I still have a lingering question about, so we've raised some issues that we can clarify and call out in our comments. In terms of specific recommendations for where we think that we are recommending that the PUC do something different than their original proposal. or just clarifying, I guess I'm going back to Matt, like, are you making a suggestion for a different baseline data source? Like, I'm a little unclear where we left off. You know, we've identified problems with basically every possible source of developing the baseline data. So I'm wondering what your actual recommendation is, Matt.
Well, I volunteer myself and Ken Jones to form a subcommittee to reopen the statute to determine the best way to develop the baseline data. I don't have any, I think you need to ask the legislature to hit pause and to reconsider Act 18 and amend it. And I'm not sure how to accomplish that while the PUC is still under the obligation to produce a rule in January. There's probably a solution that someone has already thought of. I don't know of it, but this is where the system.
I'm not clear what's wrong with the tax data adjusted for off-road, like what Colin is working on. I guess I don't understand if there's a problem with that, but.
Okay.
So yeah, if you have any additional clarifications that could help us refine our recommendation there, that is something we struggled with the pacing group, that there are problems with all possible data sources, and like the inventory is out of date and everything else. So yeah, that was one lingering area where it wasn't clear if we were to adjust our recommendation, what we should adjust it to.
Matthew?
To piggyback off of that question, it does seem like the Act at least attempts to handle the non-road diesel part by excluding it explicitly. So you're not going to have ag equipment or forestry equipment use there, as long as there's a data set that lets you see what proportion of that fuel sale is used for those end uses. I think the sticky part is propane, for example. So I don't think there's any other component of the sector that accounts for propane. So for your generator running, generator use of propane, I don't think anybody would say that that's really a thermal end use. A pool heater probably is a thermal end use, so is cooking. But I don't think the Act handles that situation well. The next question is just what percentage of total emissions from the sector are attributed to propane. So it's sort of like that last 5% of getting to perfection and accuracy may not be worth the squeeze, or may not even be possible. But it would be good to have that mismatch quantified, even if it's a really rough estimate.
Thanks. And Sam?
Thanks. My question's about something slightly different.
Yeah.
So if others are still speaking on that topic, I'll defer to them first.
Yeah, I think a couple hands went up earlier, and I apologize. Deirdre and Ken?
Yeah, just a quick mention. So I'm glad Rick mentioned for people to send things in writing to the subgroup's recommendations on the proposal. But just because, you know, in the last 20 minutes or so, we started to think about recommendations that don't fit in statute. So I would just recommend that the feedback provides, you know, given that we want the tag to vote on this proposal and the feedback at the next meeting, two things to be separate. So a process that fits in within statutory requirements as it's written, and then a different process that, you know, Ken or Matt may be proposing that does not fit in the way that the statute is currently written. Just so those things are clear for people, I think that would be an important thing for the next meeting.
Ken?
Yeah, I just want to get clarification for myself. We use the term thermal sector, but is the clean heat standard supposed to represent the fossil fuel use for the residential, commercial, and industrial sector? In which case, and I'll use a specific example, Green Mountain Coffee Roasters uses natural gas to roast coffee. That might not be considered a thermal requirement, but I believe it falls within the clean heat standard. So somebody using propane in their backyard grill or using propane for cooking still, I believe, falls under the clean heat standard. So I do think certainly the separation of ag and actually forestry, I'm not sure where that falls, but the separation of off-road use for ag clearly, but I'm not sure there are lots of categories of these fossil fuels being used that don't fall under the clean heat standard. If I'm wrong, please someone clarify for me.
Can I respond to that?
Mm-hmm.
So first off is there was a very explicit, because it was done at the request of farmers, to exclude dyed-diesel, and that is in the statute, and that's in the chat, the specific line and verse, and that is not a de minimis amount. It's 20 million, 25 million a gallon, 25 million gallons a year, depending on which EIA year estimate you look at, but soon to be very specifically defined, because we've added that line item in the tax forms that are required to be filed by fuel sellers every month. With regards to propane, I think there's a disagreement about what it's our interpretation from the fuel sector that is for heat and hot water. And yes, hot water is used for bathing and other, but it's also used for pool heating. So one might say, no, it's included there. But when you look at the registry that's been approved by the PUC that every fuel dealer had to fill out, it has a line item for backing out non-thermal gallons, which I guess we're going to have some sort of formal proceeding to determine whether or not cooking is included as a non-thermal purposes, because you have hundreds of entities that sell 20-pound, 5-gallon barbecue tank grills. Maybe 10% of them have registered. It's a very small amount of propane. But those that did under the assumption that I'm going to raise my hand and do the right thing and show that I registered as a seller of fossil fuel, knowing that these gallons that I'm selling, your Home Depots, your Abishon Hardwares, your Agway, none of them are obligated, and thus I wouldn't have to pay.
All right. So that's obviously a point of clarification. Sam, you're going to take us in a different direction, and then I think we need to move on. Did you have a different point you wanted to bring up before we close out this conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Just quickly looking back, and apologize that this took me a few minutes here to think through. On slides 7 and 8, excuse me, which discuss setting and adjusting the thermal sector emissions reduction requirements, where it says that the TAG recommends using the GWSA life cycle based inventory factors versus the ANR life cycle based factors. Just wanted to confirm, and by all means don't need the response now, but would be helpful, although I know we're short on time. But before we, I guess, sign off on this, I just want to be sure that we're, including something that will be consistent with the out-of-state emissions that occur based on the different energy uses, right? So in other words, I don't know exactly what's included in the GWSA version versus the ANR version, but would be good if someone could lay that out, just for our awareness ahead of signing off on this, just to make sure that, my concern is that we're including all of the anticipated upstream portions of the LCA analyses for the different fuels within the trajectory. Thanks.
I can just offer a quick clarification that our intention here was not to resolve all those issues of how the LCA is going to be done and what the emission factors are therefore going to be, but to clarify that the process we're undertaking with support from Opinion Dynamics that results in that PUC approved emission schedule should be what is used here for the reconciliation, because otherwise, as written, it was sort of defaulting to using the current ANR upstream analysis as the source, and we felt that it should point to the process that we are currently undertaking. So the specifics, I think, will be TBD, but it will reflect whatever we develop through our own process. I think that's our recommendation.
Okay, thanks, Emily. I think that makes sense.
Matt, a quick closer.
Yeah, quick closer, just to articulate what Emily put in the chat, what Ken referenced earlier, and to identify this as an issue that is not going to be resolved here in the next 30 seconds, which is, yes, the statute says this about collecting information on gallons sold by registered entities and obligated parties. And then, yes, the statute also says this is what the information is in terms of calculating greenhouse gas emissions in RCI. The two do not work together. And that's the reason for opening up the statute, in my opinion. Thank you.
The
Okay.
two being the registry and the tax. Sorry, just
No, the
Plenty more to discuss.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, let's not open up this right now. So I want to move it quickly to Deirdre for PUC updates. And then we will get to the opinion dynamics presentation.
Yeah, so I can be quick so we can keep moving. So I think at the start of this meeting 2 weeks ago, Esther signed yet, it now has. So reminder, that was the PUC housekeeping bill that had a few, the clean heat standard in it. Probably the most substantive is the changing of the DDA from having to appoint it June 1st of this year to approving their plan and budget September 1st, 2025. And also that the fuel registration date is now no longer at PUC discretion, but going to be June 30th of every year. Something I don't know if we've mentioned in TAG meetings is that, you know, there's public engagement sessions going on. So there was just a third one last Thursday. I personally was unable to attend, but understand that it was well attended and had robust discussion surrounding the clean heat standard. The additional upcoming 3 meetings are not yet scheduled, but we can keep the TAG up to date on when those are. There's not an obligation to attend, just the intention is that those are bringing in different and more voices to comment on the clean heat standard. I don't think there's really a need to provide an update. You know, we have the pacing proposal out if you all want to comment as an individual or on behalf of your organization. The deadline for those comments is next Wednesday, the 19th. Based on the cadence of these meetings, it didn't make sense for that deadline to apply to the TAG. So the idea is that the TAG will vote at the next meeting, which is the 27th, with their final recommendation on the proposal. And I think that's it from my end. If there are any questions, happy to answer. But I'm not seeing any.
I am not either.
Excellent.
do you mind again providing an update on the vacancy, Deirdre?
Yes, good point. So that closed 2 ago. So we are reviewing the applications that came in, and we'll probably have an update for the commission's decision on that at the next meeting.
Thank you
for mentioning that. I meant to mention.
Great. If there's, Liz?
Hi, good morning. I did not attend last week's public meeting. I had attended the one previously. And Deirdre, are they now summarizing where we're at on the clean heat standard? Because the one I attended was there wasn't a summary, and it was just waiting for the public to ask questions when the people are not even, they don't have time to listen to these 3-hour meetings. So how is it working now? Is it a little bit better? Because it wasn't, the one I went to was not great.
Yeah, I think not only, so I think after the first meeting, the facilitator along with the PUC helped to provide like more of a synopsis, a 1-page kind of plain language of the bill as like starting point. But I'm not sure. I think the structure and the format of the meetings might change a bit for the remaining 3. The first 3 were kind of set in stone to be more of like a feedback, like getting people just to provide those comments. And the next 3 might be more educational, where you kind of level set at the beginning. So
right, the one I went to was asking for feedback when the people really didn't know what was going on. So it seemed to be, and the time of day, 2 o'clock, you're not going to get people who work. I mean, there should be a few that are in the evening so people can attend. It's just my opinion, but it's hard to get there at 2 in the afternoon.
Yeah, the first and the third were in the evenings, but the second one was in the afternoon. So I think the next 3 will also be staggered in different times in terms of during a workday and not to try and make sure people can attend. But absolutely. And if there are any other comments on public engagement, feel free to send them to me, and I can make sure that they make it to our facilitator and,
Okay, thank you.
Facilitating. Thanks.
Great.
Rick,
We all set to move on? I would just remind everybody to make sure you're muted. We're getting some feedback from one or two of you. Okay, we're moving on to the presentation from Opinion Dynamics. We have Zach and Kevin Ketchman here today to talk to us about their proposed approach. Here, the object here is to make sure we better understand what they're proposing, and we can endorse where appropriate, of course, but mainly to provide feedback on aspects that raise questions and or concerns. So with that, Zach, I'll turn it over to you. We've got 30 minutes. We've got 30 minutes on the agenda. Let's try to save some time for Q&A.
Thank you, Rick. Good morning, everybody. Is everybody able to hear me okay and see my screen?
Yes.
looks good.
Excellent. Okay. So thank you all very much for giving us the opportunity to come chat. As Rick mentioned, I'm going to walk us through first handful of slides. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Kevin Ketchman, who's our LCA expert, to talk you through some details. I do want to note there have been a couple very minor changes in this deck that we've made versus what was distributed, and Catherine will make sure we get a final copy to you so that they can get posted and shared with everyone. There's also a companion written memo that I think was already distributed to the tag. We're happy to accept written comments on that. Folks would like to provide them. This presentation is relatively short, and so our preference, if it's okay with everyone, is to try to hold comments as we go. I'll pause once in the middle for comment before I turn things over to Kevin, and then we'll open it up fully for questions at the end. But if there's any critical clarifications, please jump in and ask. Okay. So I wanted to just start out and just remind you all of how we understand and conceptualize our scope of work for the project we're doing here overall. The core of our work, as I think you heard from us when we presented our overview of our work plan, is development of measure characterizations to support the development and implementation of the CHS. And so in service of that, we are going to be developing Clean Heat Standard Technical Reference Manual. When we get a little bit later in this deck, I'll kind of remind us a little bit more about TRMs. But at a super high level, our work is in service of producing a CHS TRM that's accurate and credible and also usable. As I'll talk about on the next slide, development of a life cycle emissions factor schedule is a core component of that because we need that to be able to estimate credibly carbon reductions associated with the measures we're characterizing. So today, our plan is to give you an overview of our proposed methodology for estimating life cycle emissions factors for the fuels that are relevant to the CHS. This is a relatively high-level overview that's designed to kind of orient you all to our general approach and ensure that everyone's on the same page about what we're doing. We're not going to be going in great depth today around how we're specifying our modeling. We do expect and understand the tag is likely going to have a lot of very specific questions, and we really look forward to hearing them and hearing your feedback, making sure that we can account for it in our work. I do also want to note kind of all our deliverables, we are focused on making sure that they clearly and transparently outline all the assumptions that we make so that everyone is able to understand the decisions we're making as we go and provide detailed comments if they desire. So just a little bit of background of what Act 18 requires. I think you all are aware of this, but thought it was just useful just to contextualize. So, we are, you all, the PUC is required to establish a schedule of life cycle emissions rates for heating fuels and electricity to support the Clean Heat Standard. We need these life cycle emissions rates for our work to be able to characterize the CO2 equivalent emissions reductions that will be produced by clean heat measures in the TRM, and therefore we will be developing those as part of our scope. We also know, per the conversation on pacing this morning and in other places, that this schedule will be used for other purposes as well. And so please, feel free to remind us of that as we go, if there are specific characteristics of what is needed for work that we aren't doing that we need to take into account when we develop this schedule. Act 18 has some explicit requirements for the development of the schedule. I've just listed the text from the legislation that's relevant in here. I'm not going to walk through it in detail, but I will say that we have reviewed all of this and are seeking to adhere to it in development of the emission schedule. We want to kind of just note from an approach perspective that we are going to adhere as best we can to IPCC rules and the methodology that the Vermont ANR is using, but we recognize, as I think this group has already discussed, that there's some concerns with some conflicts in statute and how things are being done a little bit differently in different places. And we're trying to be as conscious of that as we can be in all of our work. Okay, just to close my sort of background here, just a quick reminder again, in thinking about the product that we're working to produce at the end of the day here, which is a Clean Heat Standard TRM. So a TRM, this is a sort of background about how TRMs are typically developed, are typically, well-documented, transparent documents that use credible and standardized calculations. And then just a critical piece here that I want to just remind us all of is that they are designed for ease of operation and use. We're trying to do everything as accurately and clearly and credibly as we can here, but what we produce is also going to need to be used in implementing the CHS programs and needs to be usable by other entities that haven't necessarily been part of all these conversations. So I just want to add that as a piece of background so that everyone kind of understands how we're thinking about approaching this. I will pause here for a minute in case there's any background questions, and then I will hand things off to my colleague Kevin to talk through kind of details of our life cycle methodology. Okay, not hearing anything. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, don't see anything. That's great. Go ahead.
Great. Kevin, you want me to go to the next slide?
That'd be great. Thanks. Okay, so we're framing our work, the emission factors, around two kind of life cycle phases. These are the upstream life cycle phase and the combustion emissions. And so upstream is inclusive really of all the activities that would be like resource extraction through transportation, delivery of those finished fuels to distributors and EGUs, electric generation units. There's a lot to unpack on this slide, so it's going to take a minute. So I'll just try and go through and then we'll come back. So combustion is just looking at the point of combustion of that fuel. So if you think about an electric generation unit, it's the combustion there. If you think about natural gas, it could be combustion at the EGU if it's being used for electricity generation. It could also be combustion at homes or businesses. We'll aggregate these two into one final emission factor that's going to be used for the different measures and within the CHS. But we have to make sure that we have the right boundaries, that they're clear and it's transparent as you go to use those emission factors. And so this gets to back to the piece that needs to be unpacked, right? For upstream emissions, we can only go as far as the different models that we're using. We're going to use GREET. We'll get to a summary slide next. And so we'll be using GREET for some of those emission factors. GREET will take us up to delivery to those EGUs or the fuel distributors. At that point, we could still be missing some of those emission factors that we're going to be trying to account for, these gaps in the CHS itself. And so the CHS is accounting for the energy change in the home or at the end user. And so it's between the delivery agent or the EGU and the homeowner, the end user of that fuel that we're trying to account for. So I think the easiest would be to walk through a couple examples. So if we think about the electric grid, again, we'll have upstream and combustion emissions. Those will both be at the EGU. So upstream, everything to the EGU, combustion at the EGU. The CHS will be accounting for the energy change in the home. So the gap here is the line losses, transmission line losses that we would want to account for. Moving it from site energy use in the CHS to source energy use at the electric facility. If you think about delivered fuels, again, you have the upstream emissions going to the delivery agent, for example. You'll have combustion in the home and the business. And so there's a gap of delivering that fuel from the agent, the supplier, the vendor, to the home and business. And so those things we're going to try to account for as we start to build out the CHS algorithms and assumptions. But we want to just be upfront and recognize and acknowledge that the upstream and combustion emissions aren't going to be inclusive of everything. There will still be some factors that have to get in there. And this doesn't get into the biogenic and the other discussions that have been happening in the tag as well. I do want to pause because it is a lot to go over. Are there any questions on this slide before we move forward? Great. Zach, if you go to the next one. So for simplicity of presenting, we've tried to move the fuels into like 3 general buckets. So we're looking at grid electricity, liquid/gaseous fuels. This is going to include natural gas as well, and then wood fuels. So what we're doing is we're trying to use 4 main resources. This is the AESC report on long-run marginal emission rates. That includes combustion and emission rates. Then the other is the GREET model 2023 version, which is the latest version of it. We'll use that for the liquid gaseous fuels as well as, just for the upstream emissions there. And then we're using the Vermont Energy Sector, the ANR report on upstream life cycle assessment emissions. This was presented at the last TAG meeting. And then the EPA hub emission factors for combustion emissions. We'll also be trying to account for any kind of temporal adjustments that need to be accounted for. So in electric sector, this will be the renewable energy standards in Vermont. There's also some other potential adjustments, maybe if the EPA proposed greenhouse gas emission standards for heavy duty vehicles that would be trying to be accounted for in transport of these fuels to the different suppliers. And so we're choosing these 4 sources because they're scientific. They have a reporting frequency that fits well within a TRM standard, and some of them, like AESC and the Vermont Energy Sector LCA, are Vermont or at least regionally specific, which is, always an ideal scenario for a TRM. And that fits then within like our sense of like what a TRM needs to be, right? Scientific, replicable, and transparent. None of these are behind paywalls, so these all be resources that could be continually used moving forward. And Ken, I just see your hand up, and I'm happy to take your question.
Yeah, I maybe I don't understand the Vermont Energy Sector LCA methodology well enough, so I'll just ask the question. For the issues of biodiesel and renewable diesel, does it include land use?
A great question. So it's not clear to me either. I think these are the things. So I'll just preface all this is our proposed methods. We still have some review and technical details that we want to hammer out. From our perspective, it does look like it's including land use change. The GREET model has that capability, but it's not clear if that's exactly what's being accounted for in their LCA.
A clarifying question, Kevin. With respect to grid electricity, are we, I don't know the AESC 2024 report, but so my question is, are we looking at the emissions, the long-term emissions of the Vermont portfolio?
Yeah, and actually, Zach, if you go to the next slide, we'll cover this. This is the next thing. So the AESC report is the avoided energy supply components in New England. It is an ISO New England specific report, so it's regional. It is not Vermont specific. To just quickly address your question, Rick, it is because it's regionally specific, it looks like Massachusetts is outweighing Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine in terms of the energy sector, in terms of the emissions, the long run marginal emission rates. We are going to try and counter that by applying these renewability adjustment factors to there. We've been talking with NV5 and the PSD on how to make those. We've presented or sent over something for them to review in terms of how we're approaching it. But in a nutshell, we will adjust the renewable generation to 100% by 2035. That's based on the H289 legislation that we know was just vetoed back at the end of May, and so there will be some potentially a change there in terms of like the time frame of when it goes towards 100% renewable. The upstream emissions, though, will not be moved to zero. Upstream emissions still exist for renewable resources, so the electric grid will never get to zero emissions emission factors, but it will start to approach zero. I think we're looking at numbers that are topping out at like around a 200 scale.
Well, let me just respond. I mean, that's fine with respect, of course, to upstream emissions. I'm gonna have to take a closer look at this. I really do have concerns for the reasons you mentioned, with not treating the grid emissions as, or not calculating them as related to the Vermont specific portfolio. You're gonna try to get the renewables in there, great, but there are other resources as well that we have entitlements to that don't produce marginal emissions from gas facilities. So there are some real questions here that I'm gonna look very closely at, and I'll follow up with some written comments on.
And
Yeah.
Rick, I know and Kevin, I know there's a couple other hands up, but I will just note, as Kevin mentioned, we've been talking with MD5 and the PSD about this. And my hope is once that we've finished our conversations with them, that we can share kind of very transparently with y'all the exact methodology we're using here. I think you will see that on a gross level, I think it is appropriately accounting for the shift to resources that aren't, doing combustion emission. I think the micro details of exactly how we all feel that should work probably still, have some places where they could be refined.
Okay, thanks.
I'm not sure who had their hand up first. On
Well,
my screen.
we're kind of running roughshod over your request to hold questions till the end, and I don't recall how many more slides you have. What is your preference here?
We have 2 slides. I'm happy to tackle questions as we go.
Okay. I'm just gonna go from the top of my screen then. Haley, and then Matthew Baker Poole, and then Floyd.
Thanks. I just wanted to call out that I did participate as a Vermont stakeholder in the 2024 AESD study. And again, don't really have a specific comment, just to flag that new to the 2024 AESD, there is a toggle in it that considers state policy versus not state policy with emissions. And depending on how that's toggled, the report takes the AESC's long-term marginal emissions rate and reduces it by Vermont's tier 2 and tier 3 standards. So I just want to make sure that's being taken into account, so that if you do decide to discount or reduce by Vermont's total res, and you're on a certain policy toggle, you might be double reducing based on the tier 2 and tier 3 requirements. So that's a lot. I just wanted to raise my hand as a resource and probably follow up just to ensure that we're understanding the AESC report the same ways. Thank you.
Yeah, Haley, I appreciate that. I just want to quickly address that. So I was not aware that there was an Excel workbook or another file to be able to do the toggling, but we do recognize that we are potentially double counting on the emission rates. And this, I think, goes, Rick, to your question as well about having Massachusetts being the weighing factor. When we looked at our approach to adjusting these on the renewability, we actually find that we get pretty close to the short run marginal emission rate and the annual average emission rate for Vermont currently. And so we feel like it's a decent adjustment. It's not going to be perfect. And I think there are some technical in the weeds and things that we could do to refine it. But we're not proposing anything that seems unreasonable from that perspective. And Haley, we appreciate your comment and any kind of additional information you can share.
Great, will do.
Matthew Baker Poole?
So I believe you mentioned that we're stopping at either the point of distribution or at the point of generation for fuel and for electricity respectively, and that gap, I believe, is going to be in scope for estimation. I just wanted to confirm that. And then also piggybacking off of Haley, I think the user interfaces for AESC also have loss components. And I think they have a default loss rate. They call it energy loss value. So I interpret that as being transmission and distribution losses and capacity related losses of 9% with a peak loss rate of 16%. So yeah, just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, thank you. I think the transmission loss would be in scope. We want to make sure that that's captured, since we're looking at the CHS is site energy, the LCA is source energy, and so we need to make sure that we're lining up on units.
Hey, Matt, can I just ask a clarifying question before we move on? Do you know if that 9% value you cited is an average or a marginal line loss rate? I think this is a real question we're going to have to tackle about what we end up using and how we treat CHS you know, a change in loads. So
I don't have an answer to that, but I can
okay,
look for it.
we'll go
I
look it up.
think it's marginal.
That would
But
be good.
a follow-up
be
would be
su-
good to confirm.
I'd be surprised if it were average.
Floyd?
Yeah, so a couple of quick points. To the question about, I think it was Ken. Question on whether the GREET accounts for land use change. There is and I'm sure the opinion dynamics folks know this. There's a indirect land use change module that can be used with GREET. It's called C Club, Carbon Calculator for Land Use Change. So that's a standard part of that methodology, just to highlight that. I did have a question on I think slide 7 with respect to the liquid gaseous fuels temporal adjustments. It says static. And I assume that's with regard to like target setting and things like that, but not necessarily with respect to reflecting improvements in fuels that are coming in. You know, because I would hope that we're not setting a program, or we're not recommending setting a program that is static with respect to not incentivizing producers to bring in even cleaner fuels over time. And the fuels can be cleaner through efficiency improvements and lower carbon intensity process inputs and things like that. So I just want to make sure that that's not what's being suggested here. And I think that's all I had.
Yeah, thank you, Floyd. So I don't have an answer for you. We are aware, at least of the C Club module that is in GREET. It's not clear whether or not that's being accounted for in the Vermont energy sector LCA. As for the liquid gaseous fuels and making them static, I think right now we've been looking at that as a simplification for the clean heat standard, and that this might be something that needs to be revisited each year to see what the actual fuel carbon content is that's entering into the state. Right now, we haven't found, and if you're aware of, we haven't found any good information on how that might be changing and projecting out to year 2050 or beyond. And so we have to make some decisions and make some assumptions as to what is best suited. And I would hope that the fuel suppliers see the value in reducing their carbon content of their fuels, because it would just equate to more savings.
Yeah, and before Sam responds, just real quick. So the experience in California has been the CI targets have decreased and the producers have responded by decreasing their CI through cleaner feedstocks, cleaner processes, that sort of thing. So want to make sure that gets incorporated into the final product.
Yeah, thank you for that comment.
Sam?
Thanks. Just to quickly build on Floyd's point here, I think, it's important to understand, as I know you guys do, that all of these resources do incorporate electricity into their life cycle carbon intensity score, and I think actually pretty heavily. So, for example, landfill gas sourced unit of RNG with a CI score of maybe around 50, in a lot of cases, 20 of that could be electricity as an input to the upgrading process and to the facility. And so a point of consideration when we're looking at, ultimately ratcheting down. Sorry, can you go back to the previous slide? When we are looking at ratcheting down upstream emissions from electricity to 100% renewable generation by 2035, to the extent that you're also looking at fuels that are coming from inside the state of Vermont, or whatever, boundary condition you feel comfortable with associated with that area of electricity generation mix. If we can, I think it would make a lot of sense to also adjust that portion of the CI for fuels that's related to electricity, using the same assumptions that we're doing for other technologies that use electricity. Just wanted to flag that for you guys, because I think, we have a lot of the same considerations as Floyd when we're looking at just what we expect these industries to do over time in terms of CI. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I think we'll try and address that in responses to comments. I think just from my hip, I think there's a difference between use of AESC's values and use of GREET to get at that kind of granularity. So we can take a look and see what we're able to do within AESC and in our adjustments and how we might address those. But I fully hear your comment. Zach, why don't we go? Oh, sorry, Rick.
No, keep going.
Yeah, let's keep going.
Okay, so for liquid gaseous, the Vermont Energy Sector LCA presented a framework for estimating this. Again, this was presented last week. We feel like that framework is appropriate to try and use again for the same fuels. So we'll follow their framework, reviewing things for biogenic and making sure that the proper accounting is occurring. But we are going to update for GREET 1 2023 and Andrew Beck, who was presenting, called out that there was a difference in GREET 1, 22, and 23 in terms of how biogenic emissions are accounted for. We caught that as well when we were making some updates and looking at that. We still don't understand exactly how that nuance change will affect the final product. So we want to still do some review there. But we want to combine the upstream emissions that we'll get from emission factors that we'll get from GREET with the emission factors from the EPA emission factor hub, which is specific to combustion emissions. But again, we need to review those two to make sure that we have proper accounting. We don't want to be double dipping or accounting for, in particular, any kind of biogenic emissions that are occurring in the upstream or accounted for in the upstream that then are being accounted for again in the combustion emissions. I think we got some questions too about static emissions. And so I want to try and clarify, and Zach, you can jump in here as well. I think it's challenging to project how fuel pathways will change over time. And so in keeping with transparency and replicability of TRMs, we're considering static emission factors for certain fuels as like kind of a best fit solution. And when we say static, it's not that they won't necessarily change with code baselines as they change or fuel standards as they change, but it's that if there's no fuel standard that's impacting their emission rate, then it's probably best and consistent to keep those emission rates static moving forward. I believe that would be a conservative look at what the energy savings are. And again, this is something that can be revisited year after year and looked at to see if there's better assumptions. But if we start to try and make complicated guesses and projections that aren't replicable or aren't transparent or become too complex and complicated to be able to be reviewed, that could end up actually being a detriment to the CHS long term.
Yeah, and Kevin said it, but just to say it again, we're not suggesting that there shouldn't be a process throughout the CHS to update these emissions factors, that we are suggesting the emissions factors themselves be held static throughout multiple years of the CHS. What we are saying is, for example, if we develop an emissions schedule now for a measure that is implemented in, say, 2025, that we are suggesting in 2025, the emissions factor that we're proposing for the life of that measure be held static. But as the actual conditions change and as actual data becomes available about how fuels are changing in the future, the emission schedule itself should probably be updated to reflect those things. So I don't know if that's helpful, and I don't know if that addresses the comments that were made. We're very happy to take thoughts about how we can do this better if people have better suggestions. But that's sort of just to clarify what our suggested approach is.
Yeah, Matthew.
I think the pacing comments will kind of lend clarity to this, because if, for example, there's some agreement around at least prospectively setting a declining CI schedule that isn't flat between 2030 and 2050, that value could be used as a baseline or a minimum CI reduction rate.
Zach, just remind me, when can we expect to see the detailed or the first set of measure characterizations draft or I know we've talked about this schedule before. I'm just remind me.
We have a draft set of measure characterizations that are like what we call early wins, which are characterizing the kind of measures we all understand better already now that is coming very soon. I think our schedule's in the next couple of weeks. But I will be transparent and say I don't think that we are going to have a complete emission schedule ready to go at that point that's in final form. So we didn't have the emission schedule as a separate deliverable in our scope of work with the PUC, and so we're still sort of talking to them about exactly when and how that will be delivered. Our first full set of measure characterization, so all the information we're expecting to present, we have scheduled for the end of August, and you will certainly see an emission schedule by then, but I would hope that it would be quite a bit sooner.
Thanks. Lloyd?
Yeah, real quick. This is with regard to the memo that was sent as part of the materials. I really appreciate the Opinion Dynamics folks recognizing that basically the well to tank emissions are basically the same, regardless of whether you're talking about transportation or non-transportation uses. The only caveat I would add for your consideration would be some slight adjustments may be needed for parts of the life cycle. For example, the transport distances of fuels. I'm sure you guys know that, but just want to put that on the record. Distance from Iowa to California is about 800 miles more than Iowa to Vermont. So just want to make sure that that's quantified in there, because it does make a difference. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's a good comment. Zach, do you want to go to the next slide? We'll try and keep this quick. This is Wood Fuels. Want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we'll have some opportunity, I hope, for some questions after this. In general, the Vermont Energy Sector LCA is Vermont specific. It is pretty standard practice to use the prioritize state-specific data over others. It is not always available to us when we're working on TRMs in different jurisdictions. Clearly not CHS TRMs, but like EE TRMs, energy efficiency TRMs. So we don't always have state-specific data available. Sometimes we do have to use national or regional data, and so that can be problematic in those scenarios. And so whenever we do have state-specific data, we do like to prioritize it. It also, being that it's state-specific, it's going to give us what we feel like is probably the best information as to like those travel distances and the wood sector availability and capacity for delivering those kind of fuels. We also want to recognize though, or acknowledge that there's been a lot of discussion in the tag about the biogenic accounting. So we're reviewing the Vermont ANR Energy Sector LCA report and make sure again that we have proper accounting. We also, from previously, we want to use the EPA emission hub factors or emission factor hub estimates for combustion emissions. We'll have to do a little bit of review to ensure that we're getting the right accounting of the biogenic emissions. And so this would cover wood chips, wood pellets, and cordwood. Again, static emission rates moving forward, but as we discussed, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to remain static year in and year out. And so with that, that is our last slide. We can field any kind of questions on this or elsewhere. And appreciate everyone's time.
Any final questions? We've gone over our time limit, but if you got questions, Matt.
Yeah, I apologize. Great presentation. Is there a list? Did I miss it of all the eligible measures and fuels that you're looking at?
It is. Yeah, it's in the memo. It should be all the fuels that are listed, and that will even break out fuels that the Vermont Energy Sector LCA covered and the ones that weren't covered that will follow that approach but have to be developed new or fresh.
Okay. Yeah, I think we want to comment on that. So if that's in the memo, I'll look at that. Thank you very much.
And just to be clear, Matt, the memo has the list of fuels. We previously delivered a month ago or so at this point, the full measure list of all the like the clean heat measures we're going to be characterizing for this work, which is inclusive of fuels, but also has the actual, clean heat measures that aren't fuels.
Great. If there are no more questions, Catherine, I'll turn it to you. We're going to go to a break. I'd suggest compressing the break, perhaps. Zach, Kevin, anything else?
Thank you all very much for your time, and we look forward to any further written comments or any other information you all can provide, but really appreciate the time.
Well, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much. This is very helpful.
Yeah, let's plan for a 5-minute break. Come back at 11:31. How about that? Give you a full 5 minutes, and we'll start immediately with our Equity Advisory Group report. And I would love it if we could have Chris Trombley, our guest speaker with the EAG, actually go first, if that's okay with you, Emily and Matt. Just make sure we have enough time for all that. So see you again in 5 minutes.
Great. Thanks again, Zach and Kevin. Much appreciated.
Again. Okay, the next session, we ask the Vice Chair, Chris Trombley from the Equity Advisory Committee, to join us today so that he could provide an overview of the equity framework and rubric that was shared with you. I think the second version was shared with you over a week ago, and answer any questions you might have, but also focus particularly on how we might use it as a tag. I don't think that's a prescriptive response, but he has included in the memo some thoughts about that. So let me share my screen here. I can find the share screen. There you go. There you go. And just let me know, Chris, where you want to start.
Yeah, great. Right from the top. So, Rick, Emily, thank you for allowing us time on your busy agenda. I understand you've guys been at this for a while, so I appreciate the time. So the technical advisory group and the equity advisory group, we're kind of operating on two parallel paths. You know, you guys are moving forward with your charge, and we're moving forward with our charge. It came to a realization that as policies, recommendations, as discussions are evolving, we felt there was an opportunity where, how do we bake in equity considerations in the development process so that we're not assessing impact or criticizing a recommendation at the end, but we also recognize, like, we can't participate in every conversation, and so we came up with a tool, and I'll be honest, this is basically two different impact assessment tools. One is it's formed from the Just Transition Committee established in Vermont. So you'll see that in just kind of this front page. We reference the guiding principles for just transition. That's really the foundational document. But what we found in reviewing it was it wasn't as specific to Clean Heat Standard, and it requires some scoring. And we really were attempting to provide a tool to allow the technical advisory group, if it so choose, to consider equity considerations as it's writing its recommendations. And it's not a prescriptive tool like you shall use this. It was a tool that we felt was it's really meant to call out assumptions, generate conversation, and be able to mitigate any unintentional harm, or just make an informed decision before moving that forward. So really, just in this rubric on the preamble, we just kind of highlight that we're starts by recognizing disparities in allocation of resources and outcomes, distributive equity strategies target resources to adaptation and mitigation affecting the communities and populations most impacted. It's understanding that up front and just having that awareness. And second, in the procedural equity, the last bullet on the screen, just often referred to as equitable planning and implementation. so that communities have a meaningful opportunity to participate. I think it's interesting. I heard earlier about somebody was sharing some feedback about the public outreach, and we've had the same difficulties. And what we're finding is just engaging the community on this topic has been difficult. It's a complex topic. You kind of have to be in the game to get it, and conveying that to a broader audience, including vulnerable communities, is a challenge. So this tool is meant to kind of help prompt challenges that might come up for those vulnerable communities, kind of understanding that participation up front might not be happening. And if you scroll down just a little bit more, on the contextual equity, we're really just, what are some adaptation strategies that account in the low-income communities, Black communities, Indigenous, it goes right through this level list. And so the idea is that we're not delegating to a third party saying, hey, here's our recommendation, make it equitable. And so that's kind of the background. Where the Just Transition Principles was a good start. We also used the City of Austin's climate action plan. They had more decarbonization and electrification of building envelopes effort. And so we incorporated some of those questions into the tool. So we're hoping that this is a tool that touches on a broader range of topics that could come up in policy development. So if just let's go right down to the action. So I mean, the concept is, I'll stop talking just so we can kind of get right to questions. But really, the idea is that as you're preparing that policy or recommendation or whatever the term being used is that somebody's completing this equity rubric. It doesn't have to be a formal. To be honest, like you can kind of go through it and just in a more of a conversational setting, try to walk through those questions and answer them. We found when we did that with the straw proposal that came from the technical advisor group, we had 3 different people. We kind of all thought we were on the same page, and we quickly realized, like, oh, we're coming at this from very different, and we highlighted where one person said a harm, the other one said a benefit. So just multiple perspectives was helpful. And it's really just the very simple goal of this is just to identify and address harmful impacts. I think everyone's moving forward with best intentions, and sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. And that's where this is supposed to draw out some of that into the conversation and give an opportunity to finalize a policy recommendation with those equity considerations built in. So it's instead of at the end of the process, we're trying to move it up to the beginning of the process, recognizing like the AG is not going to be able to participate, and I don't think that's realistic. So it's not a mandate, but we're trying to put this forward as a helpful tool. We've shared that with the PUC for their help, and I'd love to hear feedback from this group. Is this a tool that's of interest? Was your current process for assessing impact to these vulnerable communities? And it's just starting a conversation and having a stronger output of policy. So let me stop there, and we can go through the questions if that's helpful, or if we can just kind of stop and just check for understanding of what the intention is, because it seems like that's where most of the questions were coming from.
So is Brian still with us? I know he might have jumped to another meeting, but Brian had raised some questions about, how we were intended to use it and whether or not you were still also open to feedback on its use. And I'm just curious, Chris, if you have a response to that.
Absolutely. Absolutely open to feedback. Being drafted in, separately from the tag, it
would have been nice, like probably in retrospect, that it was co-developed. But so, you know, it's a conversation. Just the outcome that we're looking for is we're less concerned about the tool, just more that assessment and consideration is reflected before a final policy is recommended.
Yeah, Chris, it's Brian Woods. Thanks, and Catherine, thank you. I think Chris did a good job explaining how it, answer my one question about how this is intended to be used. And really interesting, Chris, to hear you say that when you ran it through it, that you got, varying results from different people, which I certainly, that's not unexpected, but I guess the group would need to understand how to reconcile that kind of feedback. But maybe you can help me out here. It says the steps are prepare the draft policy, but then the questions are about actions. And it wasn't clear to me whether, because you heard, I don't know if you were on the call earlier, but like there's a lot of, like there's the draft policy of the clean heat standard as it's kind of laid out in the statute. And then this group is working on all of the different elements of that policy in order to be able to make recommendations on how the PUC would implement it. Is the idea that this would be applied at the high level policy, like is a clean heat standard, on its face as it's laid out in Act 18, equitable, and if it's not, or are the measures that are in there to address equity, robust, sufficient, need more, or is this kind of like on an action level where it's like, when you're doing the carbon intensity scores, is that, something you would talk about versus, the clean heat credit budget? Is that equitable? Is it better from an equity standpoint to encourage a particular, we talked about what the measure mix would be. Are there measure mixes to achieve the reductions that are required that are more equitable because while they meet the CO2 reduction or the greenhouse gas reduction requirement, they also meet reduction requirements of other co-pollutants in other areas? I really don't understand how this applies to that. And then I'm really trying to wrap my head around, in the entire context particularly at the Climate Council level of equity being centered in this entire process, how that actually works.
And it might be helpful just to look at some of the specific questions while we answer.
So to answer the question broadly, Brian, I mean, I don't think this is clearly a one-size-fits-all questionnaire. So say, for example, the health section, there's clearly benefit to residents that are able to participate in a conversion to a clean heat measure. But it is the recommendation that's coming out. Is it harmful, neutral, benefit? You might be working on a policy topic that maybe doesn't necessarily apply to health. Fine, it's not applicable. You can move on. So say, for example, with the next section, affordability. So affordability might come up when I think you have to consider how you're pricing the credits. How does that impact affordability? Does it incentivize more low-income credits being retired sooner, or does it not? So just what's the cause and effect of the policy that's being recommended? I can't say this applies to every single item. I think that's a judgment call for, just speaking for myself, that's a judgment call for the TAG of how can we use this to have a more equitable outcome. So it's kind of a generic answer, Brian, but is that closer to what you were looking for?
I'm going to let Ken go ahead.
Yeah, because I think
usually he clears up things that I ask.
Yeah, I think I'm piggybacking on what you're saying, Brian. We have not yet. Well, there's an elephant in the room with regards to the clean heat standard, and that is it will raise the price of fossil fuels. And to the extent that a low or moderate income household or another disadvantaged group in Vermont is not participating in programs to reduce their fossil fuel use, it will increase their costs. But if you listen to the discussions the TAG is having right now, that isn't a part of it. I mean, I guess we're working on the bricks that build a house, but that house has this result, and that is non-participating households and businesses in Vermont will see higher prices. And yes, we can and will, look at how to overall increase participation, but those aren't, those are big issues that aren't a part of our deliberation at this point. And so it is hard to take it right, as it's like today's discussions, the carbon intensity value for renewable diesel, if that's a higher value or a lower value, what is its impact on variously disadvantaged populations in Vermont? I'll say it, I don't want to think of it that way. I mean, we need to think, and I'm not even sure it's the TAG, but really look when this is getting closer to implementation to say, okay, are there mechanisms to make sure that non-participating, and I'm focusing on the non-participating households and businesses can have damages reduced? Great topic, whether it's a TAG topic or not. And I say non-participating because I think we're all under the presumption that any participating entity, the programs are designed in such a way that it is their economic advantage, and because it reduces the use of fossil fuels and the reduce of combustion largely, then it will have all those other benefits. So again, do we have to think differently about those questions? I think that's where my head is, that your points are incredibly important, but they aren't a part of our building these bricks to this house at this point. And now others, and that may be misstating what other people think, but that's where my head is.
Yeah, let's hear from some other people. Floyd, your hand was up.
Yeah, thanks for this. Really appreciate it. When I worked with the environmental justice communities in California a few years back, a recurring theme was kind of the urgency in resolving the problems they were having. So my question, and I haven't been tracking the equity group very closely, but my question is, on this rubric, is there an element with respect to temporal, is there a temporal element to the rubric? In other words, can the person answering this questionnaire reflect kind of the urgency? Some measures are going to be more quickly implemented, can be more quickly implemented, or can be implemented immediately in some cases, versus others that may get higher benefits, but, are kind of a long-term sort of solution. If they're going through asthma, for example, they're going to want some immediate solution. So I guess my question is that factored in, or can that be factored into the rubric?
So just by the form itself, there's going to be some immediate benefit, and there might be some harm. And the idea is that in the overall justification section, the person responding really kind of documents, like, here's why I think that's okay, or or we have a plan for this, or we know this going in, and it's not. Again, it's not necessarily meant to be the final report. This is a policy development document. And so it's only as good as the user inputs. So I would encourage any temporal comments would be captured in the overall justification.
Yeah.
With respect to questions around affordability and health and others as well, but affordability itself, the way you've got it written here suggests that, and Ken was alluding to this, that we would prefer, and I agree, clean heat measures that will reduce costs for vulnerable communities, and in fact, for everyone, ideally. I will just say that I regard the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements of reducing, greenhouse gas emissions as a constraint, something that has to be met, something that will guide all future action. So it's a guardrail. It's something we got to stay, within it. And what that means, therefore, is that we want to minimize the costs of meeting the goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And that means that not necessarily will we actually be able to reduce costs for folks relative to the status quo. But what we want to do is minimize the impact altogether, the total cost of meeting the solutions. And Brian actually got to this earlier when he talked about the different kinds of portfolio mixes that we want to take a look at. Least cost, most emissions, there are all kinds of things here. So it seems to me it's going to be the case. It could entirely be the case, or in many cases, so that true that a clean heat measure will in fact increase costs for folks, but it will be the lowest increase cost relative to other clean heat measures. So I am hopeful that in the long run, I do believe in the long run that reducing our carbon emissions economy-wide is going to reduce our overall energy costs, but it's going to take a while getting there. So I see this rubric as something that we can use to qualitatively test the relative merits of different measures, but it won't necessarily, it may or may not, we'll have to think about it, disqualify measures.
Thanks, Luce.
Yes, thank you for the rubric. It does seem very subjective, and I'm hoping there'll be guidelines on what's considered harmful, what isn't, for each of the items, because some of them might be able to be defined, so we're all evaluating the same concepts. I have been approached by a landlord in Bristol who wants this committee to come see their apartment because they don't understand how they're going to be able to add heat pumps to their old wooden building with small rooms. And so, the big question is the landlord's tenants, and I feel like maybe this rubric would be helpful for that, but that is a big concern that I've heard from people, is how is it going to work with landlord and tenants, and a lot of the low-income people are tenants. So how are they going to be able to share in the cost savings or, the advantage of going to heat pumps? So that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, so just real quick, it's kind of intentionally subjective. Everyone's going to be coming from a different place of life experiences and where they worked, and it's kind of intentionally that way. So it's not going to be a prescriptive, objective. It's meant to draw out conversation. But you highlight on a very important topic that we're struggling with at the Equity Advisory Group of low-income housing rental. And we all know that Vermont's housing stock is extremely old. And how do we incentivize landlords who don't pay for utilities to take advantage of clean heat measures? And so, you just think about drafty windows, and you're on, resistance electric heat, or you're still on an oil system. It just, that the highest energy burdens borne by the most vulnerable populations in Vermont. So just, I think just as an Equity Advisory Group, we're kind of struggling with those folks who may not be able to access some of these measures. They're already energy burdened, and how do they benefit from this as measures or solutions to mitigate that or export.
Jared.
Great, thanks. Also want to just express appreciation for developing this. Really valuable math here.
Jared, your voice is breaking up. Your internet.
I think just copied some of the tag. Can you hear me okay?
No, we can't.
Let me try again.
There you go. Yeah, going off video might help. Go ahead.
Can you hear me okay now?
Better.
Okay, I was gonna go find headphones, but I'll try this. I was just expressing appreciation for the rubric. I think it's really valuable. There's a let me grab headphones and I'll come back.
Okay, we'll go to Matthew and then come back to you. Matthew?
Yeah, I just wanted to read the sections of equity that I pulled out that are within TAG scope. So this is ACT language. I'm going to summarize it and not read it. But it includes assessing impacts on greenhouse gas emissions, carbon sequestration and storage, human health impact, land use change, ecology and biodiversity impacts. Skipping to the next section, facilitating the program's coordination with other energy programs, calculating the impact on fuel prices, and calculating savings associated with public health benefits. So I think it's well within the scope of the TAG. As we were mentioning before, potentially proposing amendments to the Act or proposing companion legislation, and the final report made to the Commission to apply this rubric to either the whole program or individual parts of the program for these particular criteria, in addition to the ones outlined in the rubric.
Thanks very much. Jared, do we have you back with headphones?
Do I sound okay now?
Yes, better.
Great. All right. I'm gonna risk turning my camera back on. Sorry, having some tech issues today. Okay, so I think Matthew made some of my point, which was thank you. This relates to aspects of our duties that I don't think we've really addressed yet, and still haven't quite figured out where in the process they will be addressed. So whether it's this rubric or some other mechanism, I do hope we can give some attention to those sections Matthew was just pointing out. I do appreciate that it probably has applicability at sort of the overall clean heat standard level and for specific measures. I don't think all measures are created equal, as we've been getting into the weeds on greenhouse gas emissions, so they have differential sort of impacts or benefits related to health, non-greenhouse gas emissions, of other air pollutants, et cetera. So just want to endorse using this or some other process for getting into some of those details. I did have one comment on another area of consideration for the rubric, if there's room for anything more in there, which is something about climate resilience. For example, that there are sort of differential benefits for supporting climate resilience. Heat pumps come with cooling and potentially some indoor air quality improvements inside the home. Wood heating, for example, doesn't plug into anything, so there's some built-in resilience there. So being able to just acknowledge where there's co-benefits of some of these measures for climate resilience would be appreciated. Thank you.
So that's a really good point, Jared. I think VSHA, we oversee 18 multifamily rental properties targeted at low-income households across Vermont. None of them are on clean heat measures. I mean, it's all either natural gas or oil boilers. And so, we want to get to that transition. How do we get there? For the benefit, and not only, but the cost reduction for the tenant and for managing it, but also we manage 18 mobile home communities across the state. It's over 1,000 lots dedicated to low-income housing. Those are communities that are at about 30 to 40% AMI. They would absolutely benefit. I mean, they're all, for the most part, they're either all kerosene or propane, right? But the wait list for weatherization is 2 years, doesn't cover all the costs. The barriers to upgrading electrical facilities isn't often within their scope of control. We're either relying on the utility or so just their ability to access a measure, even if they wanted to, would be delayed by years to receive those health benefits and the cost reduction. And some of them may never be able to fully realize some of those benefits. So, you know, we're kind of struggling like, how do we mitigate that impact? But because if our existing system, I think there's just a reliance on or an assumption that there's a lot of money in IRA. We got a great weatherization programs. There's already existing programs, but there's a lot of gaps that aren't serving the existing population. So just increasing that demand, we're looking for some help on how to make this better to serve that population. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Chris. I really appreciate it. And I did mention when I was talking to Chris in preparation for this, there is another parallel process that I'm not sure everybody's aware of, where the Vermont Climate Council has subcommittees that are looking at updating the climate action plan. And part of that is to look at how the clean heat standard is being implemented and the equity implications. They have a pretty robust public engagement process that's very separate just for the Climate Council. So there's monthly or quarterly progress reports that the public engagement process is developing and can be accessed. So that's another source of input that, you know, the TAG has, the Equity Advisory Group has, to see what is being what is being learned and what is being heard on these outreach efforts, and specifically on the clean heat standard. So we are now about 15 minutes behind, but want to thank you very much, Chris, for
thank you so much
spending the time with us. And I hope we can have you back as we have more questions. I know when we talked, you offered that if one of the subcommittees that's looking at some of their recommendations wanted to invite you back to work with them on this rubric, you'd be happy to do that. Can I say that again for you?
I think we have a large group of motivated individuals who want to see an equitable implementation of the clean heat standard, and they would be excited to participate. Just to kind of, sometimes the first one's the hardest. So happy to participate. We'll find somebody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Right. Okay, Rick, if we move to public comment, see who we have that might want to address any of the topics we've covered so far today.
Well, is there a quick report from Emily and Matt?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Did you guys want to add anything about generally the progress? Emily's not here, but Matt's here.
Yeah, so the Equity Advisory Group met on Tuesday, and it was a pretty robust discussion about the way the legislature, in many ways, it's a sort of a parallel track to what we've talked about today, in which the legislation has put us in a path that may not be equitable. And we openly questioned why only like 2/3 of the credits can go to those of means and only 1/3 to low and moderate income, and why that wasn't reversed. And so there was a pretty interesting discussion of the political considerations and the economic considerations and the environmental considerations of why that was chosen, but no resolution.
Thanks.
This is Ray Albrecht, consulting engineer. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, so Ray,
Okay.
we're ready to move to
Sure. I'm just going to say just a quick comment relative to transmission and distribution line losses. I'll put together some comments, including a tutorial on how line losses are calculated and how to look at the marginal impact on line losses due to added grid load. So I'll do that over the next few days to try to help clarify people's understanding.
Thanks, Ray. Annette.
Hello, this is Annette Smith with Vermonters for a Clean Environment. I thought I'd provide you all with a little report on the public outreach meetings because I attended all 3 of them. I will say that they were very poorly attended. And I'm not sure what that reflects, except that my experience lately is that people are pretty much maxed out and on Zoom meetings and it just may not be the best way to reach people anymore. But if I learned anything from those meetings, I think I want to second, it may have been what Lou said about one of the big issues is renters and landlords and those types of buildings that do not seem to be possible to convert in a way that would be in compliance with the law. So I think that's the primary takeaway that I have with this. My other own personal issue has to do with, I don't have an alternative to propane, but I do think that paying special attention to the rental housing areas is an important thing to do. So thank you.
Thank you, Annette. Any other comments from our public participants? Okay, that leaves us with about 25 minutes for our breakout groups. And we have really just two breakout groups, the pacing group and the bioenergy. And I am not expecting a report back from you. And we'll just wanted to give you the time that we had left so that if you had the opportunity to just check in, figure out what your next steps are, reflect on anything you've heard today, that you could use that time. And then we'll just come back. Actually, we're really only have 20 minutes because we have to come back at 2025 for Rick to adjourn us. But if anybody who's in the credit group wants to join either of these two groups, feel free, because that's not meeting. And the public can also should be able to join any meeting. I've opened the group, the meeting rooms, the breakout rooms. If you don't see it pop up, you should go to your more icon at the bottom of your instructions, and you should have a choice between joining one of those two. I hope it's working this time. Is it working for folks? All right. Anybody have any questions? Looks like we're moving into the rooms. And Ken and Michelle, just a reminder, please, I'll make you co-hosts. Please remember to record. I'll do that right now before you leave. Don't leave yet, Michelle. I'll make you a co-host and see if I can jump in with Deirdre. If you're not, if you're going to one of these or Rick, you can use your co-host capabilities to record as well. Recording again.
Great, thank you. Well, let's finish up with just any thoughts that any of you have for particular agenda topics for our next meeting. We, of course, will put our heads together in the next couple days and do a draft as we usually do as we always do every meeting. If there's something in particular you think we need to be talking about or folks we should hear from, let us know. I'll be talking to Catherine and I and Emily and Ken and Michelle and others. We'll all be checking in order to put the agenda together. If there are any immediate thoughts, please share them now.
Yeah, I've got one. I believe it was at the end of calendar 23 that the PUC put out a request for the types of information that are necessary to characterize a clean heat measure. I believe, maybe I was dreaming this, but the reason I think we need to revisit that is there is being some discussion about establishing a preliminary registry, because as you know, installed clean heat measures began in January 1st, 2023. And so a registry would include information necessary to characterize that measure. But I don't know whatever happened. I'll go back and look, but I think it was in end of 23 that PUC put out a request, and there were several responses, at least in my dreams, about what information is necessary to register a clean heat measure. And that's going to be really important as we understand the trajectory of credits that have already been established that then are going to lead to the potential study about how we increment upon that. So that's a topic.
I really appreciate that, Ken. I absolutely agree with you. You've raised this with me before. I've chatted briefly with Ed McNamara about it. Why don't we, we'll add that to the agenda. And we'll obviously confer with you, Deirdre, about what that might look like.
Sure, and just for context, I'm actually trying to find the exact order language, but it was an order addressing early action credits where we asked what kind of information would substantiate, you know, a clean heat credit claim to have pursued an action that installed a measure, and ended up issuing preliminary recommendation on what kind of records to keep. So that's where that was, and I think it was in.
Thank you, Deirdre. I'm glad it's not just a dream.
No.
Great. Anything else on this agenda preparation? If not, then is there anything else anybody wants to add before we close? I want to thank all the members of the TAG for their time and efforts, and members of the public for sitting in and assisting this process, and of course all the other folks, other experts who've joined us as well. And with that, I will close the meeting and wish you all a good weekend. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you all. Deirdre.
Thank you.
Thank you.